Hello everyone. Today we are presenting our paper titled Barriers to the Adoption of Autonomous Vehicles in Rural Communities. I am Kiana Alikhademi and my co-authors are Diandra, Prioleau, Priya, and Juan Gilbert. Although rural areas account only for 19% of the US population, these areas account for 53% of road fatalities. Transportation in rural areas are impacted by following factors: funding limitations, declining economy, insufficient infrastructure, and lack of accessibility. Before going deeper into the paper, I would like to define rural area to give you more context. According to US Census Bureau, rural communities defined as any area which is not considered urban based on factors such as population thresholds, density, land use, and distance. Many research has shown that autonomous vehicles can serve as a potential solution to solve the existing transportation issues in rural communities. However, we think that autonomous vehicles can exacerbate the existing biases and disparities if we are not reviewing the limitations and barriers of these technologies in rural communities. Therefore, our paper will investigate the barriers for adoption of autonomous vehicles in these areas, which will be followed by our recommendations and insights for companies and policymakers on how to overcome these barriers.
Now we're going to talk about some of the potential barriers to adopting autonomous vehicles. There are 4 significant areas of impact to consider when adopting new transportation technology. These include financial impact, transportation infrastructure, policy, and demographic effects. We'll begin with finances. While rural ridership continues to increase, rural public transit spending does not reflect this due to insufficient funding to build infrastructure. This is reflected in a report by the American Public Transportation Association, which found that between 2007 and 2015, there was a 7.8% increase in rural public transit compared with a 2.3% increase in urban ridership. AVs will also cost more than the average car initially, posing issues to rural residents as travel price is of high concern to rural residents when considering modes of transportation. According to a study regarding transportation concerns in rural and urban populations, rural residents were 15% more likely to rate travel prices as their top concern in considering modes of transportation. Urban sprawl may also increase as people are free from the burden of driving, which could be further exacerbated by the adoption of AVs. This migration away from city centers can potentially begin to push into rural communities and displace current rural residents who will be unable to afford the changes that will be made to their communities. To move on to transportation infrastructure, much of the literature regarding the planning and design aspects of AV implementation do not address issues unique to rural areas. Much of the literature instead focuses on city planning of AVs in urbanized areas. Citizens interact with transportation infrastructure and design nearly every day, so it is important to consider how AV infrastructure will be implemented in rural communities specifically. AV implementation will also require many changes to current transportation infrastructure, including roadways, signage, parking, and advanced digital technologies. For this reason, the technological infrastructure of rural communities needs to also be considered critically before deploying AVs. Studies have shown that the technological infrastructure of rural communities is not always sufficient for supporting new digital technologies. For example, in a Pew Research Center study, found that 45% of Americans living in urban areas use ride-sharing apps such as Uber and Lyft, compared with just 19% in rural areas. This difference can be attributed to the lack of stable cellular and broadband services in rural communities, which is essential for ride-sharing services to work. This is just one example of how infrastructure is just as important as the technology that will be implemented. There are also concerns that rural economies will not have sufficient funding to effectively build the infrastructure needed for AVs, especially in unincorporated counties where population density is low. Infrastructure needs to be designed to meet the needs of vulnerable populations within the rural community, such as the elderly and people with disabilities. A case study in rural Texas found that rural elderly residents in 3 different counties were willing to pay for public transportation options that would improve their quality of life. However, their willingness to pay would not necessarily be able to cover the cost of these necessary improvements. Moving on to policy, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act and the Transportation Equity Act were passed in the 1990s and required states to have transportation plans. However, rural communities did not have the organizational structure to handle transportation planning mandated by TEA, which caused significant issues in transportation that can still be seen today in rural communities. Current policy is focused on product development and safety. However, there is no definitive policies regarding AV infrastructure, especially as it will relate to rural communities. However, the Transportation Research Board is beginning to investigate how transportation agencies with low funding can implement the connectivity infrastructures necessary for AVs, as well as invest in the maintenance needed for highways, bridges, and roadways. Policymakers should aim to work with rural residents to create transportation technology and infrastructure that will serve their needs. Moving on to demographic effects, rural areas comprise a large percentage of older adults. Approximately 17% of rural residents are 65 years or older, with approximately 25% of older Americans living in rural communities. Elderly rural residents face higher transportation costs than their urban counterparts due to inaccessibility of public transport in rural areas. It is crucial to ensure that AV transportation will be accessible to older rural residents once it is implemented. There are also more current transportation challenges for rural residents with disabilities. The availability, accessibility, lack of appropriate infrastructure, limited bus schedules and bus stops, and lack of information for bus schedules, fares, and routes are all issues that are present in current transportation systems. The National Center for Mobility Management emphasizes how automation does not imply anything further with regard to vehicle type. The accessibility of those vehicles, public or private ownership control, user costs, and perhaps most importantly, how humans inside and outside of the vehicle will interact with it. These current transportation disparities will be perpetuated in AVs if they are not addressed during the design of AVs and before their deployment and adoption. Black older residents also face different barriers to public transportation. According to a study done in rural Alabama, Black older residents were more likely to report limiting their activities due to lack of transportation than their white counterparts. Bias in facial recognition technology can also affect the safety of autonomous vehicles, which will need to utilize facial recognition tools in order to stop for pedestrians or potential passengers as a taxi would. Studies have shown that facial recognition cannot sense darker skinned people as accurately as lighter skinned people. Understanding bias in facial recognition technology is important when considering autonomous vehicles, since stopping for a pedestrian can be the difference between life and death.
Now we will discuss some of the recommendations that we think are important to addressing the barriers of the adoption of autonomous vehicles in rural communities. One area of concern that we've highlighted both in this talk and within our paper surrounds affordability. Rural communities typically have a lower average income than urban communities, which can infer that many rural residents may not be able to afford autonomous vehicles, especially when they're first deployed. Therefore, there is a need for government regulation to ensure companies who are selling autonomous vehicles develop cost-effective strategies to ensure rural communities will have the financial capital to afford them. Also, we assume that over time, that ride-sharing companies will want to incorporate autonomous vehicles in ride-sharing. If this occurs, there needs to be an evaluation of their current business model to ensure that ride shares will be accessible and affordable to rural areas. Another area of concern that we wanted to highlight surrounds accessibility. We've highlighted earlier in the talk that within rural communities, there are individuals who have disabilities, and it's important to seek out their input to understand their needs and their concerns. We wanted to highlight research that has been conducted by a group of researchers from the University of Florida, where they did focus groups with blind and low vision individuals. And the focus group was surrounding autonomous vehicles and getting their opinions and thoughts about autonomous vehicles. And some of the suggestions and concerns that was raised in these focus group, one being sure that the technology has speech input capabilities and the use of a smartphone application. Many of the individuals said that their smartphone is already accessible and that it would be easier to interact with certain functionality of the autonomous vehicle through the use of their smartphone. Second, they highlighted having the touchscreen interaction as a backup to the use of a smartphone application. Third, being sure that the screens that are inside of autonomous vehicles have used contrasting colors and that the buttons on the screens are large enough to press, and also having voice-over capabilities. Another area of concern was being sure that the autonomous vehicle doesn't leave immediately before ensuring that the individual has arrived at the correct location. Another concern was being able to know which direction that the vehicle is traveling in and knowing the immediate surroundings. This is important, and they wanted to have that information relayed to them while they're in the car. And then lastly, the need to relay information about parking options and building locations. So these are just some of the suggestions and concerns from this paper and this area of research. And it's not exhaustive. It just highlights how it's very important to have focus group with people who have a disability so that their needs and their concerns are being met in the design process of autonomous vehicles. Another area of concern surrounds the potential bias in autonomous vehicle technology. There is a need for policy to hold facial recognition companies accountable for bias in their software. Early in the talk, we highlighted research that found bias in facial recognition softwares. It is possible that facial recognition softwares will be integrated into autonomous vehicle technology to recognize pedestrians and objects in the road. Therefore, it's important that the autonomous vehicle technology is able to detect pedestrians of all shades of colors. Secondly, there's a need to ensure autonomous vehicle technology can recognize pedestrians and objects in roads that are not lighted well, which is very much common in rural areas. I myself grew up in a rural community where at nighttime it's very dark along the roads because there aren't a lot of street lights. Therefore, it's important that the autonomous vehicle is able to detect people walking along the roads, that is able to detect objects or animals that may come across the road to keep both the person in the vehicle safe as well as any pedestrian that is walking along or across the road safe. And lastly, there's an importance to balance maintaining trade secrecy of companies that produce autonomous vehicles with the need for transparency of the technology. It is vital that the technology is audited continuously to ensure that we're not including biases in the technologies or to look at potential failures of the technology to ensure the safety of everyone involved. We also wanted to highlight Joy Balawumi, a researcher known for her work that brought awareness of racial and gender bias in facial recognition systems. She testified before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform and urged them to enact a moratorium that halts law enforcement adoption of this technology unless and until appropriate regulatory mechanisms are put in place. This leads to our next area of concern surrounding policy decisions. Rural residents should have a voice in the policy-making process of autonomous vehicle legislation. One of the benefits of doing this is that it allows rural residents to express their needs to the legislator in terms of what they expect and need in autonomous vehicle and how the necessary infrastructure for their communities in order to be able to have autonomous vehicles in their communities. And secondly, it would help legislators to better enact policy to build adequate infrastructure and to incentivize autonomous vehicle growth that benefits both rural and urban communities. So these are just some of the recommendations that we have come up with based on doing our research. And we hope that this talk in our paper helps to extend the conversation. And we hope that you receive something out of this talk. And we really appreciate you coming. And so now we're going to open up the floor for questions. And thank you again for coming.